So we've got four great colleagues who are going to present some initial thoughts and reflections, and then we'll have an opportunity for the audience to engage them in some Q&A. Just for, by way of quick introductions, I'm going to introduce everybody now, and then they can just keep rolling through the program. First up tonight, we're going to hear from Dr. William P. Leeman. He's a professor of history and director of the Pell Honors Program here at Salve. He's also a faculty fellow at the Pell Center. He's the author of The Long Road to Annapolis, the founding of the Naval Academy and the Emerging American Republic, and the co-editor of Forging the Trident, Theodore Roosevelt and the United States Navy. Bill, thank you for being here tonight. Timothy Neary is professor of history here at Salve, Regina University, where he teaches courses in modern American, urban, sports, and civil rights history. He's the author of Crossing Parish Boundaries, Race, Sports, and Catholic Youth in Chicago, 1914 to 1954. Tim, thank you. I'm going to take these out of alphabetical order and the order in which you're going to hear from folks tonight. Erin Redihan is lecturer of history at Salve Regina University and associate editor of the New England Journal of History. She's the author of The Olympics and the Cold War, 1948 to 1968, Sport as Battleground and the U.S.-Soviet Rivalry, and has had several articles on the Olympics and the Cold War published in various journals. Thank you, Erin. John Quinn is professor of history and chair of the history department here at Salve, where he teaches a variety of courses in modern European history. Dr. Quinn's research focuses on Irish and Irish-American history, and his most recent publication is The Rise of Newport's Catholics, From Colonial Outcasts to Gilded Age Leaders. John, thank you. Thank all of you. And to get us started, Dr. Leeman.
On the morning of December 7th, 1941, just before 8 o'clock Hawaii time, approximately 190 aircraft launched from a Japanese fleet of 6 aircraft carriers attacked the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, the home port of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. This first wave was followed by a second wave of 170 planes in an attack that lasted almost 2 hours. The Japanese raid devastated the Pacific Fleet. 18 ships, including 8 of the Pacific Fleet's battleships, were either sunk or severely damaged. Over 180 U.S. planes were destroyed and another 120 damaged. 2,403 U.S. service members were killed in the attack, just under half of them on board the battleship USS Arizona. A Japanese bomb pierced the Arizona's armored deck and exploded near the ship's forward powder magazine. This violent explosion nearly split the ship in two and sank it. The attack gave President Franklin Delano Roosevelt the public support he needed to enter World War II, appearing before a joint session of Congress on December 8th to request a declaration of war against Japan. Congress passed that declaration of war by an overwhelming vote, and the United States entered a global conflict that would forever transform the concept of national security in America. This transformation was accomplished mainly by a piece of legislation that has been called the most important legislation of the 20th century after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act, the National Security Act of 1947, and its subsequent 1949 amendments, grew out of America's experience fighting World War II and created the modern national security state in America. Not only did this legislation create such institutions as the Department of Defense, the United States Air Force, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but also it created a national security mindset that continues to dominate American politics into the 21st century. The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the American public and American leaders. As Yale historian John Lewis Gaddis has observed, quote, "Surprise attacks tend to sweep away old conceptions of national security and what it takes to achieve it," end quote. When one looks at American history prior to World War II, there isn't much of a national security concept, particularly during peacetime. Although the United States had plenty of experience fighting wars, and in fact had been founded during an international war, a pattern emerged where Americans would become involved in a conflict, raise the necessary military forces and economic resources to fight the war, and then at the end of the war demobilize and focus on other things, often economic development. And there were reasons for this. First, Americans had a long-standing traditional fear of standing armies in peacetime and large permanent and professional military establishments. These sentiments were left over from the American colonial experience with the British Army during the Revolutionary era. Second, Americans felt secure, separated from potential threats in Europe and Asia by two vast oceans. The result was essentially a temporary, as-needed approach to national security during wartime, with relatively little attention paid to the issue in peacetime. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Ultimately, American leaders learned three main lessons from the Japanese attack. First, as one of the greatest intelligence failures in American history, Pearl Harbor demonstrated that the United States was in serious need of an improved, centralized system of gathering, analyzing, and sharing its foreign intelligence. Second, it was vital that U.S. military leaders play a significant role in helping to craft national security policy, even during peacetime. And third, Pearl Harbor demonstrated the need for inter-service cooperation and coordination between the Army and the Navy, and cooperation and coordination between the State Department and the military. In the years after World War II, American leaders went about forming a new national security ideology and system that would prevent another Pearl Harbor from happening in the future. This was made even more important with the start of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. On July 26, 1947, the United States took a major step in creating a national security state when President Harry S. Truman signed the legislation that became known as the National Security Act of 1947. The Act's provisions went into effect in September with the U.S. Senate's confirmation of James Forrestal as the first Secretary of Defense. The Act was later amended in 1949 to correct the problems that had cropped up during its first 2 years of existence. The National Security Act created the principal institutions that still make up the national security establishment to the present day. First, in recognition of the clear strategic importance of air power during World War II, the Act separated the U.S. Army Air Forces from the rest of the Army and created a new military service, the United States Air Force. Second, the Act merged the Department of the Army, which was formerly referred to as the Department of War, along with the Department of the Navy and the new Department of the Air Force, into something known as the National Military Establishment, and created the new position of Secretary of Defense to oversee the nation's armed forces. The National Military Establishment was renamed the Department of Defense in 1949 and made a cabinet-level executive department headed by the Secretary of Defense. The departments of the Army, Navy, and Air Force were reduced to military departments within the Department of Defense, and the secretaries of the Army, Navy, and Air Force were made directly subordinate to the Secretary of Defense, who was the only Pentagon official who would hold cabinet rank and who became the principal advisor to the president on military matters. Third, the National Security Act gave legal authority to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a council composed of the top-ranking officer in each military service that had initially been formed informally during World War II. The original Joint Chiefs of Staff during World War II was composed of the Army Chief of Staff, the Chief of Naval Operations, the Chief of the Army Air Forces, and the Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief, a unique position held by Fleet Admiral William D. Leahy, who enjoyed a close personal friendship with President Roosevelt. The post-war Joint Chiefs of Staff included the Army Chief of Staff, the Chief of Naval Operations, the Chief of Staff of the new Air Force, and the Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief, if there was one. The 1949 amendment created the position of Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the United States. The chairman was a full-time position, replacing Admiral Leahy's former position, which had been unfilled since his retirement. General Omar N. Bradley was appointed the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in August of 1949. Fourth, the National Security Act established the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, an independent civilian intelligence agency headed by the Director of Central Intelligence. Although intelligence had been part of every American war going back to the Revolutionary War, there was no centralized intelligence agency prior to World War II. The State Department, the FBI, the Army, and the Navy all had their own intelligence agencies, but there was no real coordination among them. Each operated independently. In the wake of the Pearl Harbor intelligence failure, which was ultimately attributed, at least in part, to inter-service rivalry and a lack of cooperation between the Army and the Navy on Oahu, it became clear that greater coordination among the nation's military agencies was desperately needed. It's not that there wasn't any intelligence that the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was coming, it's that there wasn't any integration of information. Pieces of intelligence were spread among the different intelligence agencies and buried in a deluge of information and disinformation. There was no central clearinghouse to put all these pieces together. Through the efforts of intelligence pioneer General William Donovan, who pushed President Roosevelt to coordinate the nation's intelligence activities, the Office of Strategic Services was created in 1942 and became America's first centralized intelligence agency. Although the OSS was disbanded with the end of the war, President Truman created the Central Intelligence Group in 1946, which was the direct predecessor to the CIA. The CIA was charged with coordinating US foreign intelligence activities, as well as collecting, analyzing, and distributing intelligence related to national security. The Director of Central Intelligence was charged with leading the CIA and the broader US intelligence community, serving as the main intelligence advisor to the President. Finally, the National Security Act established the National Security Council to coordinate national security and foreign policy by bringing together diplomatic and military leaders to advise the President. The initial members of the National Security Council included the President, who served as chair, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretaries of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and the chairman of the National Security Resources Board. During its first couple years of existence, the National Security Council lacked effectiveness, in part due to President Truman's ambivalence towards it. He resented the implication that he lacked the foreign policy experience to be effective, and he didn't like Congress telling him where he had to go to get advice on national security matters. However, events in 1949, such as the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, the successful detonation of an atomic bomb by the Soviet Union, and the fall of China to communism, convinced Truman and other political leaders that the National Security Council needed to be reformed and made more effective. The 1949 amendment to the National Security Act added the Vice President of the United States as a statutory member of the Council and removed the Secretaries of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, who had been reduced in authority and made subordinate to the Secretary of Defense. With the start of the Korean War in 1950, President Truman regularly met with the National Security Council composed of himself, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and other people such as the Director of Central Intelligence, the Secretary of the Treasury, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were asked to attend meetings even if they were not statutory members. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor transformed the concept of national security in America. In an age increasingly dominated by air power, the two oceans were no longer seen as protection from outside threats. America's newfound superpower status and the threat posed by the Soviet Union meant that the country would not retreat into isolationism as it had at the end of the First World War. The lessons of Pearl Harbor, as well as the lessons learned from the necessities of fighting a global war, demonstrated the critical importance of coordination and integration in the new post-war world order that the United States found itself in. In the years after World War II, the United States went about creating components of a national security state, one designed to protect the country's security with greater efficiency and effectiveness. Although significant reforms have been made to the national security establishment since then, most notably in the 1980s with the Goldwater-Nichols Act, which streamlined the military chain of command and named the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as the president's principal uniformed military advisor. And then again, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, which resulted in the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the Director of National Intelligence position, the system created in the years after World War II still forms the foundation of American national security today. Thank you.
On the evening of Tuesday, January 11th, 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt delivered the State of the Union address to Congress from the White House in the form of one of his trademark fireside chats, broadcasted live on U.S. radio networks to tens of millions of listeners across the nation. As he spoke, the Second World War continued to rage around the globe. It was nearly 6 months before the pivotal D-Day invasion by Allied forces of German-occupied Europe, and it would be another year and a half before Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan surrendered in May and August of 1945. On this night, however, Roosevelt shared with the American people his peacetime vision of life in the United States following the war's end. "I do not think that any of us Americans," the president remarked, "can be content with mere survival. Sacrifices that we and our allies are making impose upon us all a sacred obligation to see it that out of this war, we and our children will gain something better than mere survival," end quote. FDR warned against repeating the mistakes made by the United States following the First World War, which included what he called, quote, ostrich isolationism in foreign policy, and the, quote, excesses of the wild 20s when the nation went for a joyride on a roller coaster, which ended in a tragic crash. Instead, the president called for a domestic policy that he dubbed the Second Bill of Rights. The goal was to achieve economic, social, and political security for all Americans, quote, regardless of station, race, or creed, end quote. Anything less, Roosevelt believed, would leave American democracy vulnerable to sliding into fascism and authoritarian rule. The first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution, the original Bill of Rights, were ratified some 150 years earlier to protect the civil liberties of individuals from infringements by the national government. Quote, as our nation has grown in size and stature, however, as our industrial economy expanded, the president noted, these political rights proved inadequate to assure us equality in the pursuit of happiness. We have come to a clear realization of the fact that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made, end quote. Roosevelt's proposed Second Bill of Rights of the mid-20th century was meant to protect the collective economic well-being of the American people. It is, in fact, often referred to as the Economic Bill of Rights. Roosevelt explained that adoption of the Second Bill of Rights meant that every American would have the right to 1, a decent job, 2, a living wage, 3, adequate housing, 4, adequate health care, 5, Social Security protections against unemployment, accidents, sickness, old age, and 6, a good education. The president was describing a social welfare state. With the Second Bill of Rights, Roosevelt was building on the philosophical and bureaucratic foundations of the New Deal programs of the 1930s, emergency measures created to address the economic devastation of the Great Depression. Historians, economists, and political scientists long have shared the consensus, however, that it was U.S. government spending to fight World War II during the 1940s, not the New Deal of the 1930s, that pulled the nation out of the Great Depression and made possible the post-war prosperity that Americans regularly described as providing the highest standard of living in the history of the world, especially during the quarter of a century between 1945 and 1970. The New Deal may have given Americans a taste of the activist state, but it was World War II that created the era of big government. In just 6 years, between 1939 and 1945, the size of the federal government grew 10 times. But while the war came to an end in 1945, the size and scope of government growth did not. So, how did a country founded on the principles of decentralized governance, low taxation, and free market capitalism allow the massive growth of the federal government into the Leviathan that we know today? In his influential book, Warfare State, World War II Americans and the Age of Big Government, University of Chicago historian James Sparrow shows how US participation in World War II fundamentally changed the relationship between Americans and the federal government. During the first half of the 1940s, everyday Americans supported the war effort on a massive scale. Out of a total US population of about 130 million people, more than 16 million, 12% of the population, served in the military during World War II, including approximately 1/3 of fighting-age men. While the first peacetime military draft in US history was instituted in September 1940, more than a year before the attack on Pearl Harbor, nearly 40% of American men who served in the military during the war years were volunteers. Whether draftees or volunteers, these citizen soldiers came from diverse geographic, economic class, educational, ethnic, racial, and religious backgrounds. Although the US military was racially segregated until 1948, 3 years after the war ended. In addition, some 350,000 women served in non-combat roles in the US military during the war. On the home front, civilians across the nation supported the war effort through rationing, price controls, and dramatic increases in federal income taxes. More than 6 million women took wartime jobs in factories. 85 million Americans loaned the government money through the purchase of war bonds. The significant and widespread sacrifice and support of the US state not only demonstrated fervent patriotism and greater unity in time of war, but it also fundamentally transformed the expectations that everyday Americans, including industrial workers, women, and African Americans, had for the federal government in the post-war era. Such heightened expectations in time would lead the civil rights and feminist movements, among other social and political movements, to put pressure on the three branches of the federal government to achieve their objectives. No group in the immediate post-war era, however, better represented the new relationship between citizen and government than the millions of soldiers returning home following the end of the war. Influenced by lobbying by the American Legion for benefits and government services for veterans, Congress and the President acted. In the spring of 1944, as the war still raged, a bill created to help veterans adjust to civilian life unanimously passed both chambers of Congress. On June 22nd, 1944, just a few weeks after the D-Day invasion, President Roosevelt signed into law the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, popularly known as the GI Bill. The GI Bill assisted veterans in the areas of hospitalization, buying a home, starting a business, and especially post-secondary education. Between 1944 and 1951, some 8 million veterans received educational benefits. The legislation allowed approximately 2.3 million veterans to attend colleges and universities, 3.5 million to receive school training, and 3.4 million to get on-the-job training. The number of degrees awarded by US colleges and universities more than doubled in the decade between 1940 and 1950. When World War II ended in 1945, only 4.6% of Americans held a bachelor's or advanced degree. By 1970, that percentage had increased to 25%. By 1955, GI bill benefits made possible 4.3 million home loans with a total face value of $33 billion. Veterans were responsible for buying 20% of all new homes built after the war. While transformative in the lives of millions of Americans, not all veterans could access GI Bill benefits. Black veterans routinely were unable to get bank loans for mortgages in black neighborhoods and were excluded from all-white suburban communities by prejudicial real estate practices, threats of violence, and other acts of intimidation. World War II veterans enjoyed a privileged place in American society during the post-war period of the late 1940s and 1950s. Years later, television news anchor Tom Brokaw referred to them as the greatest generation in his 1998 book of the same name. A Saturday Evening Post cover in October 1946 featured an idealized version of the deserving post-World War II veteran reaping the benefits of the GI Bill. Norman Rockwell's illustration shows the fictional Willie Gillis enjoying the fruits of American freedom, peace, and abundance, reclining leisurely as he reads his college textbook, with Middlebury College's real-life old chapel in the background. The scene embodies the reciprocal relationship between citizen soldier and the national government. Willie Gillis had risked his life for the nation during the war, and now his government was fulfilling its side of the bargain. A cover story 1 year later in Life magazine presents a more realistic version of post-war veterans attending the University of Iowa on the GI Bill. These vets faced the challenges of crowded lecture halls, cramped living quarters, and raising young families while trying to study. Nevertheless, they are presented in the article as happy, motivated, and optimistic about the future of the nation and their place in it. While liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans disagreed about and debated a myriad of domestic and foreign policy issues during the post-war period, the place of big government in American life enjoyed relatively widespread acceptance. Republican presidents Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, for instance, while certainly more conservative than their Democratic counterparts during the Cold War era, did not fundamentally challenge the premise of big government. Republican President Ronald Reagan, on the other hand, asserted in his first inaugural address in 1981 that big government did not provide solutions. Rather, it was, he contended, quote, the problem. The Reagan Revolution sought to slash federal spending, except on defense, lower taxes, and scale back government regulations. Yet, big government survived the Reagan era and has continued into the first quarter of the 21st century. A quick comparison of the US federal government budgets of 1954 and 2023 demonstrate how the warfare state of the Second World War and subsequent Cold War laid the big government foundations of the American welfare state. As you can see, spending on defense constituted 69% of the federal budget in 1954, which was actually down from the 84% in 1945. In 1954, the size of the federal budget was about 18% of the size of the gross domestic product. Today, 3 entitlement programs make up nearly 50% of the US federal budget. Social Security, established in 1935 during the Great Depression under FDR's New Deal, constituted 22% of the federal budget in 2023. Medicare and Medicaid, government-run healthcare programs for elderly and low-income Americans, established in 1965 as part of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, made up 1/4 or 25% of the federal budget in 2023. As you can see from this slide, the size of the federal budget in 2023 was about 23% of the GDP. Defense spending as a percentage of the budget was 13%, significantly lower than the percentage of the World War II and Cold War era budgets. On the right-hand side of the pie chart, you can see that Social Security made up 22% of the budget, and what is labeled major health care programs, basically Medicare and Medicaid, made up 25% of the budget. Those 3 entitlements then constituted 47%, almost half of the federal budget in 2023. One of the significant legacies of World War II is the centrality of big government in the life of the nation. As Americans debate the proper size, expense, responsibilities, and powers of the federal government, understanding the origins of big government during World War II provides useful context. Thank you.
Okay, so one of the outcomes of World War II, of course, is the development of the Cold War. We've had two presentations now that look at the United States. I'm going to shift us to the other side of this ideological divide and talk about the legacy of World War II for the Soviet Union. And it's no overstatement to say that World War II was absolutely devastating. There are a few populations in the world who were untouched by it. But I would make the case that the shadow of World War II loomed particularly large over the Soviet Union. So when you think about the death toll of the war, about 100 million people around the world, 25 million of those folks were from the Soviet Union. What we're looking at here, this is a photo of the Hall of Victory, which is the most sacred space in the Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow. Now, the Great Patriotic War is the name that the Soviet government gave to World War II in an effort to kind of distract from the devastation and all the wartime sacrifice. And on the walls here are the names of everyone who was awarded the Order of Victory for their contributions to the war, which really did define the country through the rest of its lifespan, which of course ends in 1991. And I would argue that World War II cast a particularly long shadow in the Soviet Union, but it also proved quite useful, as Joseph Stalin used the war to pursue an aggressive foreign policy that dramatically expanded the Soviet Union's influence in Eastern Europe and to reinstitute politically repressive measures at home. And so to get an idea of how this post-war reshaping worked, I think it's important just to spend a minute to talk very briefly about the war experience for the Soviet population. And again, the words that come to mind are absolutely devastating. So there were 25 million deaths over the course of 4.5 years. The Soviet Union was drawn into World War II in June 1941 when the Nazis violated the non-aggression pact that they had signed with Moscow 2 years earlier. And Operation Barbarossa led to a full-fledged invasion of the western frontiers of the country that led to, again, 25 million deaths, the great majority of which were civilian casualties. In addition to those deaths, there were 25 million displaced persons, 1,700 cities and towns that were utterly destroyed by this fighting. And perhaps most poignantly for Stalin, who spent the 1930s industrializing and modernizing the Soviet economy, 31,000 factories destroyed and 40,000 miles of railroads as well. And so what that meant was that the Soviet Union in many ways kind of had to build from the ground up. The photo that we're seeing here, this is from the siege of Leningrad. Again, if you're a numbers person, before the war, there were about 3.5 million residents in the Leningrad area. By the time the war ends in 1945, there are only 700,000 remaining. 2 million of those were deaths. The others were residents who fled and simply had nothing to come back for. And during the war, Stalin engaged the population through a very aggressive domestic propaganda program. And this propaganda program was intended to do two things. One, to prevent dissent, and also to promote wartime sacrifice. And so just as the United States had the Office of War Information handling a lot of its propaganda, the Soviet government had a similar arm, creating posters like these. So the poster on the left shows a bear, which is the traditional symbol of Russia, and the text reads, "Beat the German beasts." On the right, it was an appeal to Soviet women, and basically the message is, the motherland is calling. And so these images were striking, perhaps not as lighthearted as we saw in the West, but they were effective. Coupled with this, there were some concessions made. So on paper, the Soviet Union was an atheistic state. Just for the duration of the war, Stalin allowed the Russian Orthodox Church to operate out in the open. The 1930s had also featured a large-scale collectivization efforts of agriculture. For the duration of the war, there was a limited return to privatized farming. At the same time, we see heavy censorship. And so while the siege of Leningrad, again, killed more than 2 million people, the siege of Stalingrad killed another 1 million people, none of this was reported in the Soviet media. All the devastation was largely kept under wraps until after Stalin's death in 1953. And then if we fast forward to 1945, Again, Stalin is able to take this devastation and really put it to good use domestically and in terms of his foreign policy. Where we see this most clearly exacted, I think, is at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. So in February 1945, the big three, Joseph Stalin, American President Franklin Roosevelt, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill meet for the last time. And it's at this conference that Stalin is extremely successful in gaining Western concessions in his efforts to build up the Soviet Union's influence in Eastern Europe. And so it's at this conference that we see agreements that the Soviet-Polish border would be moved to the west. Stalin, at the same time, agrees to supervise free elections in Poland under Joseph Stalin. Of course, there's no such thing as a free election. So it's, in a sense, Poland is largely kind of handed over to the Soviet Union. We also see the United States and Great Britain officially recognize the Soviet control of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all of which had been achieved before the war. And as a trade-off here, Stalin does agree that the Soviet Union will enter the war against Japan within 3 months of the end of the war in Europe. And so again, it's very successful. Now, Franklin Roosevelt saw these agreements as elastic, thought that things would change over time. Unfortunately, Franklin Roosevelt only lives another 8 weeks or so after this, so there's not really the chance to go back and revise many of these. Stalin's other big goal here is to build a buffer against German aggression. And in hindsight, at the 80-year mark after World War II, we might say, well, maybe that was a bit much. But consider it this way. In 1914, Germany invaded what was then the Russian Empire, and the losses were devastating. The battles of Tannenberg, the battles of Masurian Lakes, just in 1914, brought very high casualty numbers, creating dissent and upheaval in the western reaches of Russia. Then, in 1941, the Nazis invade the Soviet Union once again. The numbers, once again, are just horrible to consider. So that's twice in 27 years. So when looked at it that way, perhaps his motives are seen to be understood a bit better. And so it is the Soviet Red Army that liberates the German capital of Berlin in May 1945. This photo here shows a Soviet soldier raising the Soviet flag over the Reichstag, the German seat of government. And once those soldiers arrive, they and their peers will be there for the next 45 years. And as the post-war occupations begin to wind down, as the war recedes into memory, and by 1949, 1950, the Soviet Union establishes the German Democratic Republic and their occupation zone of Germany. The GDR will become the most compliant and the most repressive of this Soviet network of satellites. In addition to occupying Germany itself, Stalin, in the ensuing years, expands a network of satellites that were loyal to and dependent on Moscow, both economically and politically. So we've mentioned the GDR already. We've mentioned Poland. But these also include Czechoslovakia, where there's a coup orchestrated in 1948 that brings a communist government to power. And then also Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. So Stalin is very successful in using the war to achieve some of his foreign policy objectives. We can also mention his campaign for domestic political repression as well. And so the war's end see a marked increase in the Soviet size and the scope of the Soviet bureaucracy and a return to almost total cultural repression. And one of the starting points for this was the purge of the army. So as the Red Army soldiers are returning home at the end of the war, anyone who is deemed to have too much Western contact or thought to be irredeemable, there were two options. One, that person could be shot upon their return. If they were considered, well, maybe they can be, retrained, they were sent to the Gulag. And one of the prominent features of post-World War II Stalinism is the dramatic expansion of the prison network. And we've got a photo here of workers in the Gulag, this expansive network of labor camps, most of which were located in Siberia. This new cultural repression program extends to all civilians. And so there's a lot of art, movies, music, propaganda that glorify World War II, particularly Stalin's role in it. But there's no room for any celebration of the individual. Anything that doesn't glorify or paint the Soviet Union in a positive light is no longer considered acceptable. We see the end of these wartime concessions, so the Russian Orthodox Church is forced back underground. All privatized farming comes to an end. And then going back to that figure that we gave about all the factories destroyed, there is a massive industrialization plan under the Soviet Union's new 5-year plan to rebuild their economy. And so while it's common during wartime or at the end of a war, to return to producing consumer goods. We see that happen in the United States. The emphasis in the Soviet Union between 1945 and 1950 will be continued high production of war materials. And it's only after 1950 that we start to see even small numbers of consumer goods being produced. And so when looked at this way, the war does cast quite a long shadow in the Soviet Union. Stalin lives until 1953. He actually died 72 years ago today, so it's kind of fitting we're doing this today. But he uses the war very effectively during that time. And by the time of his death, the Soviet Union had undergone a remarkable economic and military rebuild. As Dr. Leeman told us a few minutes ago, the Soviet Union explodes their first atomic bomb. And so that was a moment of celebration. Of course, before Stalin dies, the United States explodes a hydrogen bomb. So this is something the Soviet Union begins working towards as well. Moscow dramatically increased its military spending, particularly in the area of arms technology. So by the time Stalin dies, they have a wide array of weapons that can be used at a variety of ranges and inflict all sorts of damage that was previously unheard of. And the war itself, its legacy was extremely useful in that it's rebranded as this great patriotic war. The goals here, well, to distract from the devastation, right? 25 million civilian deaths is really, it really was quite tragic. There were so many folks who left for the war and just simply never returned. So many cities and towns that were almost wiped off the map. And so how do you distract from that? Well, you celebrate. And so every year, even now, on May 9th, we see annual celebrations throughout the country. This is from the 2015 parade in Moscow right here. There are war memorials, even in the smallest towns in the western reaches of the country, that are very lovingly cared for even today. When you think about it, we're a couple generations on from those who actually participated in the war, but these are still the centers of many towns in the western reaches of the Russian Federation today. This wartime propaganda still remains. And Stalin has once again kind of come into vogue in the Russian Federation. There's a lot of Soviet nostalgia, a lot of it enabled by Vladimir Putin. And so while some of Stalin's successors like Nikita Khrushchev and Mikhail Gorbachev were very critical of Stalin for the unnecessary suffering that the Soviet people faced during the war, Putin has kind of reworked that legacy once again to glorify Stalin and the war. And the Great Patriotic War is used as a unifying force in Russia today, and in some ways also used to justify the current war in Ukraine. And so the war's long shadow is something that's proven very useful to Joseph Stalin, and it's also being used by the Russian Federation today, kind of perpetuating the sense of nostalgia while also distracting from absolutely devastating losses during the war itself. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My project is something quite different, looking at the establishment of the State of Israel. And in my case, I've been teaching this course on Hitler and the Holocaust for a number of years here. And often I'll have a section in the course where we talk about survivors going to Palestine and to Israel, and I don't get into it that much. And I've always been curious to learn more about how Israel gets established in 1948. And I was surprised a little bit by some of the twists, so we'll see if you all agree as well. In May 1948, 3 years after Nazi Germany's surrender to the Allies, David Ben-Gurion announced the establishment of Israel. While World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust provided the final impetus for the new state, interest in a homeland for the Jewish people actually dated back several decades. In 1895, a young Jewish journalist, Theodor Herzl, was in France working for a Viennese newspaper. Having covered the Dreyfus case, Herzl was in Paris when the Jewish officer Alfred Dreyfus was convicted of spying for Germany and publicly degraded before being shipped out to Devil's Island to serve a life sentence. As Dreyfus had his sword broken and his epaulets stripped off his uniform, many in the crowd began to shout, "Death to the Jews." Seeing so much anti-Semitic venom among the French people, and at the same time aware that a rabidly anti-Semitic politician, Karl Lueger, in Vienna, was gaining traction and was actually about to become mayor of Vienna, These two events convinced Herzl that Jews would never be fairly treated anywhere in Europe. So having this Eastern Europe and Western Europe experience. So this is Dreyfus being degraded, right? His sword being broken, his stripes taken off his pants, right? And all, so you can just imagine hecklers shouting death to the Jews in the background. Well, Herzl went on to write The Jewish State in 1896 and is generally seen as the founder of the Zionist movement. Herzl's efforts sparked considerable controversy within Judaism. Many liberal Jews felt that they had assimilated in their host countries and didn't want or need to move to a new homeland somewhere else. Many Orthodox Jews opposed the idea of returning to the Holy Land before the coming of the Messiah, with some Orthodox rabbis even calling it a blasphemous proposition. Still, some Jews and some Gentiles were sympathetic. There was enough interest that Herzl was able to organize a Zionist conference in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. More than 200 delegates attended, representing 17 different countries. At first, the country most sympathetic to Herzl was Great Britain. In 1903, Joseph Chamberlain, the colonial secretary, met with Herzl and proposed a Jewish homeland in British East Africa, in what today would be Uganda. Chamberlain, horrified by the attacks that were then occurring on Jews in Russia, so in 1903 there were these pogroms in Russia. So there's a map of Israel and Uganda there in Kenya. He was convinced that the Jews needed a homeland right away, and they were not going to be granted one in the Middle East from the Ottoman Empire. Herzl was of the same mind and brought it up before the Zionist Congress in 1903. And this was shortly before Herzl died. Herzl only lived to be 44. He dies in 1904, so he had some kind of a heart problem. Zionists were mixed on the proposal of going to Africa, and the British settlers in East Africa didn't want it. So the British government pulled back their proposal in 1905. 12 years later, the British revisited the idea. The Foreign Secretary, Sir Arthur Balfour, issued a statement, the Balfour Declaration, calling for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Speaking on behalf of the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, Balfour called for a national home for the Jewish people. Now, he didn't specify whether the home would be an independent state or not. That's an important point, right? Was it just sort of an enclave or was it an actual separate country? At the same time, he made clear that he didn't want to infringe upon the rights of the non-Jewish population in Palestine as well. So it's a very brief and I'd say kind of nuanced and careful letter. At the end of World War I, the newly established League of Nations gave Great Britain and France mandates to oversee much of the old Ottoman Empire, which was now being dismantled in the wake of World War I. The British were given Palestine, and in 1920 they sent Sir Herbert Samuel, an English Jew, to serve as Palestine's High Commissioner. A Zionist sympathizer, Samuel encouraged Jews to settle in Palestine, and some did. Gradually, the Jewish proportion of the population grew, reaching about 20% in the early 1930s, and then when Hitler takes power in Germany in 1933, the population increases quite a bit more rapidly. By 1936, Palestinians, feeling threatened by the increasing number of Jews, launched the Arab Revolt. Angered by what they took to be British favoritism towards the Jews, the Arabs rose up, hoping to break free of British rule. The rising dragged on for 3 years, taking the lives of 6,000 people and ending just days before the start of World War II. While the British were ultimately victorious, the rising frightened the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Now, Neville Chamberlain is the son of Joseph Chamberlain, so that's the same family, right? The one who was proposing the Uganda homeland. The second Chamberlain would prove very disappointing to the Zionists. In May 1939, Neville Chamberlain's administration issued a white paper restricting Jewish immigration into Palestine, limiting them to 15,000 per year for the following 5 years, and then stopping it altogether. So that would have been 75,000 total, and the idea was to reassure the Arab population that they'd be a permanent majority, because even with 75,000, that wouldn't give the Jews a majority. At a cabinet meeting in 1939, Neville Chamberlain declared, "If we must offend one side, let us offend the Jews rather than the Arabs." Winston Churchill, who would succeed Chamberlain as prime minister in 1940, was angered by the plan. An ardent Zionist, Churchill felt that Chamberlain was betraying the Jews. However, during his 5 years as prime minister, he did not lift the immigration quotas. Now, one Churchill biographer, and that's this Martin Gilbert, he makes the argument that most of the Tory party was not in favor of lifting the quotas, and Churchill was aware of it and didn't want to take on his party, and so he didn't touch the issue. Before World War II's end, the British had a new enemy in Palestine, Zionist militants who now thought the British were favoring the Arabs. Can't win, right? In 1944, the Zionists assassinated Lord Moyne, who was Churchill's minister for Middle East affairs. I do Irish history, and so his name was Walter Guinness. He's from the Guinness factory family. Anyway, sorry, off track here. Lord Moyne was the Minister for Middle East Affairs. In the summer of 1946, a radical Zionist group called Irgun, led by Menachem Begin, a Polish Holocaust survivor, engaged in a terrorist act. They put a bomb in the basement of the King David Hotel, which was serving as the British administrative headquarters in Jerusalem. The explosion killed 91 people and injured 45 more. It was right in lunchtime, the middle of the day, and there's been lots of debate about whether any kind of warning was provided to the people, and that's a controverted point. More acts of terror occurred in the months following, leaving dozens of British police officers dead. These brutal attacks so disturbed the British that the Prime Minister, who's now Clement Attlee, who succeeded Churchill, they decided that the British would withdraw from Palestine and leave its fate to the United Nations. So Britain just sort of was washing its hands here. The UN, the new peacekeeping body that's replacing the League of Nations, Attlee spoke in Parliament about the King David bombing. This is what he said: "Of all the outrages which have occurred in Palestine, and they have been many and horrible in the last few months, this is the worst. In February 1947, the British announced their pending withdrawal from Palestine. By November 1947, a UN committee put forth a proposal to partition Palestine, giving a little more than half to the Jews, so the bluish one, and a little less than half to the Arabs, with Jerusalem left as an international city." So the Arab states were adamantly opposed to this proposal, but the measure passed 33-13 in the United Nations with the strong support from the United States. President Harry Truman was a backer of a Jewish state, even though his Secretary of State, George Marshall, was more sympathetic to the Arabs. Marshall was worried about antagonizing them and was worried about jeopardizing oil that they were already importing from Saudi Arabia. Truman's biographers note that he was always an advocate for the underdog, for the little guy, and he had deep sympathy for the many Jews who were literally risking their lives to get into Palestine because of the strict quotas. You know, they were swimming and trying to, illegally get in there. But biographers also note that Truman was a savvy politician locked in a difficult election battle. He was well aware that New York, the home state of his Republican opponent, Tom Dewey, had a sizable Jewish population, and Truman did not want to alienate Jewish voters. So for a variety of reasons, Truman lobbied other nations to back the UN proposal, and 6 months later, when Ben-Gurion in Tel Aviv declared Israel an independent state, the Truman administration immediately recognized it. This is probably, I always like this image. People probably remember this, right? This close election, the Chicago paper made a call, assuming that Dewey was going to pull it out. Also offering support to the Jews was Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader. Stalin was convinced that the new Jewish state would be left-wing, as many Zionists, including Ben-Gurion, had expressed sympathy for socialism. A lot of the Zionists were socialists. Stalin was hopeful that Israel would spread socialist ideas throughout the Middle East. So when the UN voted on partitioning Palestine, Stalin's representative provided a critical vote in favor. In January 1948, the Czechs started selling weapons to the Jews in Palestine, and certainly they would never have done that without Stalin's approval, I think. Have to check with Erin on that. 3 days after Ben-Gurion's announcement, the Soviet Union recognized the new state. Stalin would soon sour on Israel and would turn on the Jews in Russia as well, launching a paranoid campaign against Jewish doctors shortly before his death, where he was really targeting them. So Soviet support for Israel proves fleeting, but critical at the time that they voted at the UN. So the big three allies all played a part in the establishment of Israel. The British were the first to support a homeland for the Jews, and they encouraged Jews to settle in Palestine for a number of years. And Truman and Stalin later provided critical support for Israel, although for very different reasons, right? Without the support of each of these three powers, it's hard to imagine Herzl's Zionist dream ever becoming a reality. Thank you. There's Herzl there in the back when Ben-Gurion's announcing the state. Thanks.
So we've got some time for some questions. We've got some microphones that can come down. If you've got a question, raise your hand and we'll get a microphone over to you. I'm going to start, while you're still ruminating, I'm going to start with a question first for Dr. Neary. So clearly American GIs got a better deal than the Soviet GI, the Soviet soldiers who got home and were either sent to a gulag or shot. Do you have a sense, though, of the legacy of the 1930s and the political mobilization of World War I veterans? I'm thinking about the Bonus March in Washington. Was that on the minds of leaders in the Roosevelt administration in the 1940s, where now you've got 12 million people who are in uniform coming home from war? Were they mindful of what had happened in the 30s and said, let's get ahead of it and let's adopt these kinds of reforms?
Yeah, exactly. As a matter of fact, in an attempt to stay within the time frame of trying to get 4 people to present, actually cut that section, Jim, out of my presentation. But, 17,000, I believe it was, World War I veterans marched on Washington, D.C., the bonus army in 1932, and President Herbert Hoover had the military, put them down. Bill could probably tell us more about that. But so certainly, the whole response post-World War II seemed to be, let's do everything differently than we did after World War I. I mean, we're not going to be isolationists. We're going to be, internationalist. We're going to honor our veterans. And, I almost kind of stumbled over reading my own words about both houses of Congress unanimously passing anything. But, the U.S., the GI Bill was, I think there was a sense that, we need to honor the veterans, and there was also a lot of strong lobbying on behalf of the veterans by the American Legion. Roosevelt initially was thinking of kind of a GI Bill really for only those who were injured, those who had really serious difficulties, so it really expanded. But I think the kind of patriotism and the fact that that was a big part of their constituency led to the movement of the size of what it ended up being.
Questions from the audience? You guys are bashful tonight. Let me ask a question for everybody. So from a strong Soviet-Russian state to conflict in the Middle East, to the rise of the modern administrative state, to the national security apparatus that still guides America's conduct in the world today. So much of what you've described growing out of the 20th century, out of the greatest conflict of the 20th century in World War II, is still incredibly resonant and incredibly relevant today. Now, it's always dangerous to ask historians to talk about the present and to project a little bit, but I'm gonna break form here and ask you to sort of reflect. Maybe we'll start with Erin and come down the line. The history that you've studied, what does it help you understand about the very real issues that we're facing in your case in Russia today?
Right, so I think with Russia today, looking at what it did, back in 2008, looking at its kind of its test case with Georgia, and then looking at its attempts to, or its efforts that were largely successful to annex the Crimea, then moving on to Ukraine proper. There's this kind of legacy of Russia, of the Soviet Union being like this territorially aggressive state, that if you look at the years from 1948 to 1989, that really wasn't the case. But I think the idea is that Russia feels that it should be this dominant power in Europe, that I think motivates some of this movement even today. And I think that's what's made Putin feel fairly confident that he's going to be able to achieve his objectives, and there hasn't been quite as much pushback as perhaps, particularly in recent days, as you might have expected to try to counter some of this aggression.
And John, the conflict in the Middle East, it seems forever. The image of the King David Hotel
Right.
sort of seems very contemporary.
Yeah, I mean, as I got into it, I was surprised at just how much violence there was, you know, in the years leading up to the establishment of Israel, and on both sides. And then I didn't say this, but the Arab-Israeli war starts within 24 hours of Ben Gurion making that declaration. So you just think it's just really, there hasn't been a let up, I don't think, really, in the 80 years. And,
Tim?
You
So
Sorry,
the
question.
contemporary, so we were having a big debate right now about the appropriate size of government.
Yes. I think, I was looking at that book, The Warfare State, and in the conclusion, he has a kind of a parable that the conservative Democratic senator from the state of South Carolina, Fritz Hollings, used to say about how, someone might have been a veteran of Korea, went to school on the GI Bill, got an FHA loan to build the house, drove on the interstate highway system, had the kids get benefits in school, had their parents be helped by Medicare, and he went on and on and on about that. And then he said, and then one day, that veteran got mad and said, I'm tired of paying for all these social benefits for people that aren't undeserving of it. So I think that's a little bit of the tension, I think, in American society. We're seeing from institutions like universities to just every parts of our society that the federal government plays such a large role, but it's costly. We have a huge deficit, and so it's kind of what we want what we want, but paying for it is another issue. And so I think that is comes out of the sense of this time period where in the mid-20th century there was so much asked of Americans in terms of the Great Depression and World War II, in terms of sacrifice, that created this very large government. And so, my sense is that, Americans want the benefits of government, but, taxes are not so fun to pay.
So Bill, I'm going to ask you to comment on the enduring popular appeal of the strong national security establishment. But before you get started, I just want to point the microphone. We get one right down here into the third row. But Bill, if you can answer that for us.
Right. So one of the things that kind of struck me when I was preparing my notes for this talk, and one of the things that kind of struck me in general, is just how timely all four of our presentations have been, given things that are going on in the world today. I think one of the really important issues that Americans are facing right now is how this national security state operates within the United States. So while I was preparing my notes for this talk, one of the things that went on was that President Trump fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the chief of naval operations, as well as several other military leaders. And this has kind of sparked a massive debate over how this national security apparatus that was created in the post-World War II era, how that's properly supposed to work. So on the one side, you have supporters of President Trump sort of making the argument, well, the president has the right to do that. And that's certainly true. The president does have the right to do that. But I think people just focusing on that are kind of missing the point. And one of the things that struck me most is the whole idea that for this national security apparatus to work the way that it's supposed to work, or how it was intended to work in the post-World War II era, one of the things you need to look at is the relationship between the military leadership and the civilian leadership. And so I think in a lot of ways, the issue that people should be thinking about related to national security is what kind of relationship best serves the security of the United States, a relationship where presidents are going to get the best military advice available and where an officer's professional qualifications are most important, and have a situation where sometimes a high-ranking military officer is going to tell a president something they don't necessarily want to hear, or are we going to be moving into a time period where military officers have to be concerned about giving advice to military leaders, and is that going to have career consequences? So are we moving away from the way the system is supposed to work, where presidents get unvarnished information from their national security leaders, or are we moving into a period where a high-ranking military officer, they need to worry more about issues like personal or political loyalty rather than giving the best professional military advice based on their experience? So that was one of the things that certainly struck me a lot when I was putting together these notes. And just like one other thing I want to add that is an important story, General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff during World War II, who went on to be Truman's Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. There's a famous story that when he was a one-star general in the late 1930s, he was at a White House event with other military leaders with President Roosevelt. And at one point, Marshall disagreed with something that Roosevelt said in front of everybody else in the room. And all the other military officers left saying that Marshall had just ended his career by publicly disagreeing with the president. And in fact, when the Army Chief of Staff position opened shortly after, Roosevelt promoted Marshall over several other higher-ranking officers because he wanted someone who would tell him the unvarnished truth, who would give him his opinion whether or not it was what he thought Franklin Roosevelt wanted to hear. So for me, I think that's something that the American people are going to have to think about going forward.
Got a question right here, and then we'll come over here.
Taking in the national and international history that you guys discussed, I was wondering what your take was on the world entering a new Cold War. I asked this question at a roundtable Tuesday, and I just thought I'd ask it to the historians in the room tonight.
Well, I'll start with Erin with the Cold War.
Yeah, I think the dynamic has changed such since 1945 that I don't necessarily see this as the Cold War revisited. I think that the personality played a large role in the development of the Cold War. I also think that the territorial concessions, the decisions made at the end of World War II played a role here. And I don't see Russia reprising that same dominant role in Europe as much as Putin might aspire to it. And I don't know that the United States has the same sort of hold over its allies either. So I think the dynamics are different enough that I don't see that happening.
Dr. Leeman, anything to add?
Not really. I mean, I think I would agree that on the surface, yes, it seems like things are becoming a lot more tense. But I agree with Dr. Redihan that you can't really replicate what's going on post-World War II. I'm also thinking about like one of the points Dr. Neary made in his presentation about the size of like the national security portion of the national budget. I don't necessarily see the United States going back to like 69% of the national security, 69% of the federal budget going back to national security, or Americans being willing to basically being willing to go all in on a conflict like they were during the Cold War. So yeah, I think on the surface there are some similarities. Certainly Putin, his expansionist tendencies, his nostalgia for the Soviet Union. But I think when you look at it more deeply, the situation we're in now is different.
Tim, John, anything to add?
I would only say, I'm out of my depth here in terms of international affairs as a U.S. domestic guy, but I think, we had one of our McGinty speakers here who is a biographer of Nikita Khrushchev and Mikhail Gorbachev, and he made the argument in a discussion, I think, with you, Jim, actually, that the totalitarian state of the Soviet Union, as bad as it was, there's something very dangerous about the authoritarianism of Putin, and I think it would be much easier for him, in terms of like numbers and resources, to see democracies like the United States struggling, right? So we see that with the misinformation and that type of thing. So I think it's more, the test is maybe less about a military buildup and a kind of a Cold War, and more about how we understand ourselves as a democracy and a functioning society.
Sir. Yep. You should just be able to talk.
Yes. The general question to the panel. Having grown up, gone to college during the Vietnam War era, participating in the second draft, and witnessing down in Washington, D.C., what was going on with the Vietnam War, how did World War II play into what actions you participated in with our involvement in Asia there in Vietnam? General question to the panel.
So I'm not sure if the microphone picked that up, but the question is, how did the legacy of World War II shape America's response to the Cold War in Asia, particularly in the Vietnam War era? Everybody want to grab that?
A lot of our military participated in World War II that was involved in Korea, of course, and then Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of throw a couple things out there. I mean, I think one of the things that we end up seeing between World War II and Vietnam is the way Americans react to the Vietnam War is in part fallout from the experience of World War II. So Americans during the World War II era, there's very much this feeling of this is this great crusade fighting against fascism. World War II, I would say, is a war that, while it certainly had its setbacks for the Allies, there's a constant advancement and a constant advancement geographically, whether it's going from North Africa to Sicily to Italy to D-Day, or in the Pacific, the island hopping strategy. Americans were used to having wars that made steady gains and noticeable, tangible gains. And in a lot of ways, Vietnam is just not that kind of war. And so I think one of many reasons why Vietnam became so unpopular is because in a lot of ways, that wasn't what Americans expected from a war. The reasons why American forces were there were not quite as clear as they were during World War II. The way the war was conducted is very different from the way World War II was conducted. The way that the military was measuring effectiveness is completely different in Vietnam compared to the way effectiveness was measured in World War II. So I would say those are kinds of, when you asked your question, the first things that kind of jumped into my mind.
Anything?
Yeah, and then the other thing, I always tell my students that World War II is great in two ways, right? So it's both the scale of the victory, but also in terms of the obligations or the burden that it places on the United States. And there's this total war buy-in during World War II, the war bonds, the number of soldiers drafted, 16 million go over and serve. With Vietnam, it's a very different story. So World War II, everyone knew what we were fighting. Nazism is, it's a terrible thing. This is why we're here. Vietnam, it's a bit more nuanced. More men of fighting age don't fight in Vietnam than do. Only about 2.7 million American soldiers went over, as opposed to that 16 million. Whereas there was a draft age population of over 16 million. So it's a smaller percentage that goes over to fight. And I think the war, it's just treated in a different way. It's covered in a different way by the media. There is no real way to gauge this progress in the same way. And so there's just almost this sense of this World War II hangover to a certain extent that Vietnam can't really live up to, and certainly never actually eclipses.
Great question. We got a question here?
Yeah, mainly addressed to Dr. Erin, because you touched upon like Russian nationalism and annexation process, whatever you want to call it, with Putin. You know, lately with this administration, there's been kind of resurgence of, I don't want to say a model of that, but you know, nationalism and discussion of annexation in the United, you know, from the United States. Whether it's what you hear about Greenland or Mexico or whatever it is, do you see an inherent danger with those two philosophies or two models of two superpowers as probably inherent danger in the future where, you know, nationalistic tendency in a country that leads to annexation could you project or foresee any sort of large political problems in that area based on those the philosophies of both of our country maybe developing and what is in Russia presently?
Well, I mean, I like to say that historians live in the past, so we don't do so much with what's happening right now. But I think nationalism taken to its greatest extent is dangerous in any sense. If, you know, when you think about annexation and nationalism, what comes to mind immediately to me is Germany in 1936. So think about what they're doing to Austria, and then 1938, the Sudetenland, and then the rest of Czechoslovakia. And there are very few checks to that. So I think anytime one country is thinking, well, I'm just going to take this, there should be there is danger there. There should be some opposition to that. And if no one's going to step in against Putin, I think it kind of leaves the door open for other countries to start making the same sort of claim. So absolutely, I think that's a real danger.
Got a question here? Oh, microphone. Is there microphones?
Um,
Already got the microphone.
I've got the
right up there.
microphone.
Okay, so we'll go there and then we'll come down here.
As you said, it's tough to ask historians about current events, but I recently saw an article that mentioned someone on X wrote, we should withdraw from NATO and the UN. And gosh, I'm forgetting his name now, the head of Doge, Elon Musk, wrote, I agree. And I was horrified because two of the great institutions that came out of World War II were the UN and NATO. So I'm just going to open that up to you guys and see where you go with that.
Who wants to jump on that grenade?
Well, I can speak to that. I think it would be detrimental for the United States to pull out of the United Nations. I think the United Nations certainly has a role that has evolved since 1945 from its original conception, but I think it's still necessary. And if you want to take this back not to World War II, but to World War I, one of the creations of the Treaty of Versailles is this League of Nations that the United States never joins, it never reaches its full effect, and largely is rendered useless by the early 1930s. And I don't think, the United Nations isn't solely supported by the United States by any means. I'm not saying that at all, but I think that it's important for a country that is as large and strategically as important as the United States. It certainly needs to have a presence there.
So we're running out of time here, so we're going to take a couple of quick, rapid questions. We're going to start here, go here, and then we're going to come down here, and then we're going to have to call it a night. So,
yeah. So this is a question for Dr. John Quinn. I'm curious about, you talked about the establishment of Israel and the beginning of Zionism. I'm curious the role of Christian Zionists in that, with things, like the Blackstone Memorial coming before Herzl, and a lot of Christian Zionists' influence within that whole sphere in pushing for a homeland for the Jewish people.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I was surprised by, well, one, when I first looked at it, I was surprised there was so much Jewish resistance to Zionism, both from the different factions. But yeah, even from the very beginning, there was a lot of Christian sympathy for it. Yeah, so it's more of a mixed bag than I would have expected. Yeah, more sympathy from Christians than I would have guessed, and for different reasons, the Jewish community having ambivalence towards it at that, in the early days when Herzl was proposing it. Do you want to say more about that and the Christian Zionists?
Well, I was just curious about your thoughts on the role, how influential, how important they were in that establishment.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would have been interested in doing more research on the first Chamberlain to try to understand why he gravitated to it, because he jumped on it, very.
It has to do with dispensationalism.
Yeah.
The idea that they have to, have to fulfill certain things for the Messianic age.
Right. Within evangelical Christianity, right? Yeah. No, that's a big factor too. Yeah, it's interesting and complicated, and yeah.
In the back, and then we've got one more down here.
I also had a quick question for Dr. Quinn. Just about the map that you showed of over here, the split between the Arab population and the Jewish population that was proposed by the UN, and I was just kind of confusing because the map was drawn really weird, and certain sections were divided really weird. I don't know if that's just Western civilizations drawing maps with no regards for cultural or ancestral places in the land that they're drawing maps for. I don't know if you could speak on what the idea was behind the two sections.
Why they carved it up the way they did?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Tel Aviv was going to be part of the Jewish section, right? That was their big outpost, so that had to be included there. Yeah, I don't know what the thinking was. I mean, the split was 56 to 43 was the percent. It wasn't quite an equal, and it wasn't quite 50-50, so the Jewish people were supposed to get slightly more. And I'm just assuming it was where the Jewish population had migrated to. They were trying to do it based on what the existing populations were. But are you surprised it's such a sort of zigzag, and it's not that it, yeah. So
just didn't really seem to, I don't know, there were some parts of the Jewish projected area that were just totally surrounded by Arab controlled territory, so I didn't know what that was about.
Yeah.
Well, the actual plan is for economic union between the two parts, right? So there's a lot in the 1947 plan that never came to fruition, and those borders did not last a week. It's a problematic period, and we could do an entire separate event on that. In the interest of time, though, we're going to get one more question, then we got to call tonight.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. Dr. Leeman spoke about the efforts to correct the communications failures after Pearl Harbor. And if I closed my eyes, I could have heard the same comments about the corrections that were done after the failures of the Iran hostage rescue or the failures of 9/11. And I guess as historians, it's not fair to ask you to turn your crystal ball around, but we're about 25 years in, ready for the next massive intelligence failure. And what is it going to be? Is it likely to be Taiwan, or do you see some other place in the world where some mysterious thing is percolating?
What's the next intelligence failure? That may be my favorite question ever. What's the next intelligence failure? We'll start with Professor Leeman, and we'll go down the table.
Oh, great. There's a reason I don't work for the CIA and why I teach at Salve. I mean, honestly, I don't think I can say a specific geographical area where we're going to have some kind of intelligence failure, but I think I would go back and echo my earlier comments that the way the national security system works and the advice that presidents get when they're making these very difficult decisions, this matters. And I would say right now the thing I am most concerned about is that we're moving into a period where that's not going to take place. And so when presidents appoint people, particularly to national security situations, experience matters. Professional knowledge matters. And I am very concerned the period we are in right now, frankly, is inviting the kind of thing that you're talking about. So I'm looking at it more that way rather than like a specific area of the world where this could end up happening. I am looking at it as, is the national security system operating the way it should to prevent that kind of thing? Because what went on in the years after World War II, or if we're talking about like Goldwater Nichols in 1986, which is somewhat of a reaction to the Iran hostage situation, the failed rescue mission, or we're looking at the post 9/11 changes to the national security system, whether we're talking about those issues, what they are designed to do is to prevent that kind of thing from happening again. And so my concern more is the system operating the way it should? Are the right people in the positions to protect the country as it should, more than looking at a particular area of the world?
I would just add that I think intelligence is not always going to get it right, unfortunately, and we don't know what we don't know. But we saw post-World War II maybe too much faith in institutions, too much trust in the government, because of the success of the great World War II. But I do think for kind of a functioning society to work, having that, trust and expertise and process, like Dr. Leeman was saying, is important. And I think internal kind of chaos can invite vulnerability. So I would say that, these, maybe another way of thinking about it, it can take a long time to build something up, and it can break down pretty quickly. So I think trust among people, intelligence sharing among within our own society is important. So, while there was disagreement, certainly coming out of the World War II era, I think there was a sense of unity and sense of cooperation. And, obviously we all seen the problems with polarization in our society, and I think that collectively makes us vulnerable to, weakening a sense of the ability to work together as a community. So I think that's my thought.
The Irish, be wary of the Irish? No? Erin?
So I would look back to another historian, Stephen Kinzer, who wrote on the Eisenhower administration the work of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles in the 1950s, and he identified 6 monsters, 6 areas of the world where the Dulles brothers kind of injected the United States where they weren't necessarily wanted, and each of these incidents came back to haunt the United States in one way or another. Some of those were Iran. It included what happens in the Congo and the like, and I don't have a geographical area either, but look back to where the United States has inserted itself. Were these interactions welcome or not? And that could provide some hints, I think, of what's to come. But it all speaks to again our intelligence that's there and where we are inserting ourselves around the world.
Before I'll share my own just quick 30-second take on this answer. It's not going to be a place. It's going to be wary of massive tech companies whose executives do not share the values of democracy that are central to the American experience. That would be the place I would watch for the next surprise. And on that note, thank you all for coming tonight.